I've always wanted to honor a lawyer who's raised the statue of engineers. And so I'll raise the statue of engineers even more. If I start coughing, you need not run to the exits. I've been assured that this cough is not about anything contagious, so you can relax. And it's delightful to be here to talk about something dear to my heart. I'm going to go fast. I'm going to cover a lot of stuff. And the main thing I want to talk about is how to make space for the changes that I think should happen in education, engineering education in particular. So I hope to argue that there is room for improvement, say some things about why you might listen to this outrageous argument, offer a plan for improvement, and then talk about my dream version of a liberal education. So the first one, room for improvement. Now I'm going to talk about things that are centered on mechanical engineering because I've been doing that for 40 years. But I think as you listen, you will hear things that apply to K-12 and other parts of university education and lifelong learning too. There are some serious questions about the efficacy of what we're doing now. We're surrounded by amazing change. Our product is way too expensive. We have a wonderful opportunity to do a better thing. And there's literally a stack this thick of reports that say we should change. The cost of university education is growing at triple the inflation rate. Legislators, just last week, this article that was put out by ASCE had links to LA Times, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, arguing that while the economy has been going down, tuition has still been going up. Legislators are on our case. Parents are telling their kids to think differently about their college education. Industry is trying to tell us what we should teach. People are coming up with new rankings. One of the ones that's interesting is a return on investment ranking. From wealthy private universities like the other one in Cambridge to state schools, there's fiscal chaos. In the mechanical engineering department at MIT right now, there's an effort to cut 15% from the budget. If you look at the last week's headline in the Chronicle, it points out that while we're pulling back in education, other parts of the world are surging ahead. I think we in the academy are losing control of our fate, and I think we have an ethical obligation to students to fix it and get on with it.
I stand before you today to apologize. The system has failed you. I have failed you. I have failed to help you share your talent with the world when the world needs talent more than ever, yet it's being wasted every day by an educational system steeped in tradition and old ideas. Well, it's time for a new tradition. It's time to realize talent isn't just in schools like this one. It's everywhere. It's time to use technology to rewrite the rules of education. To learn how you learn so we can teach you better. It's time a university adapted to you rather than you adapting to it. It's time for a different kind of university. It's your time.
I think that is a very important advertisement, primarily because the ad agency that did it held focus groups and stuff and aimed directly at the anxieties that parents and future students have about the education system. I think there is a message there. In this room, there are probably lots of people who recognize Gordon Gee's name. He said some very heavy things recently about the state of education. Save ourselves from slouching into irrelevance? Whoa. So my argument is that education and teaching training and teaching are different. That training is a commodity. Education is the part that develops comparative advantage. And in engineering, too much of what we call education is actually training, poorly done. What do I mean by education and training? Well, I think learning calculus is training, but learning to think using calculus is education. Learning spelling and grammar, definitely training. Learning to communicate, whoa, hard stuff, that's education. Learning a CAD program, training. Learning to design, very much education. In fact, in many cases, the parts are about training. Integrating them, thinking of the holistic part is about education. It's not always clean, but in many parts of what we do, that applies. The training, excuse me, the training is the codified stuff. It's the stuff that's kind of known to be true, it's been accepted. It's much more about knowledge than about insight. And as you go through life, when you're a kid, it's mostly about training. When you're a student, it should be a balance of the two. And when you're an adult, if you're really lucky, you're spending a major amount of time seeking wisdom and education while you're doing ad hoc training for the things that you need to know. But training is a commodity. Professionalism has evolved to the point that there was a time when you could be a respected professional because you knew some things. That's not enough. One of the things that's really important for the young people in this room is to realize how much more productive you have to be to earn what you're consuming. First world people consume huge amounts. Just coming down here to give this talk, I'm consuming more than most people on the planet will in their entire life. It's hard to make that worth it. So I believe the game has changed in a very fundamental way. And I believe education is the part of the puzzle that provides the comparative advantage. You know, knowing stuff's not enough, solving problems, creatively solving problems. The thing that you do that gains you a productive edge is much more complex and nuanced now than it once was. But let's look at training. If I went to a Bad Teachers Anonymous meeting, I'd have to stand up and say, my name is Woodie Flowers and I'm a bad teacher, because I'm part of the problem and I fully acknowledge that. This is an unambiguous statement. These are my students.
The engineering graduates of MIT have been right through the system of public assessment. But what real understanding do the creme de la creme have of basic principles if they can't work out how to light a bulb with a battery?
Do you have any idea why it's not working?
Battery could be dead, the bulb could be bad, I'm hooking it up totally incorrectly. I'm not an electrical engineer, I'm a mechanical engineer.
Now, as you can imagine, that breaks my heart. And I kind of think I know what happened there. But it was not yellow journalism, it was a BBC documentary. So there's some questions about the right stuff. You know, my office mate and colleague Warren Searing supervised Kirsten Wolf's thesis. She did a great thesis that looked at engineers 10 years out from our department. A survey that got incredible results, 46% response rate. That's statistically solid as a rock. So one of the questions she asked is, where did you learn what you think you know, or what you know? And don't look at the stuff across the bottom. I'll give you a closer look at that. But look at the pattern. The blue means learned as an undergraduate at MIT. The pink is learned in graduate school. Yellow is on the job, etc. So let's look closer at the stuff underneath. The stuff on the left is the ME core, which I argue is dominated by training. The stuff in the middle is stuff that I think is dominated by education. It's the professionalism stuff. The stuff on the right, I think, is dominated by uber education. It's kind of the philosophy part of what you're doing and why you're doing it. So let's look back at that plot with those grosser labels. So it's very clear that graduates 10 years out think that they learned the core of mechanical engineering in our department. There were some other very important questions. One was frequency of use. How often did you use the stuff that you were taught? Blue here means never. The red-orange is pervasively. Another question was, what were you expected to know? Blue here is none. and red-orange is ubiquitous. It was expected to lead or innovate. I think it's reasonable to superimpose learned at MIT on used pervasively. If you were designing a product and you got that kind of match, you might ask yourself some questions. Because the stuff that we spend a lot of time on contrasts strongly with the stuff that people use a lot. Now that survey was about what was learned. The question was what you had learned. Ben Lender did a thesis, it was a wonderful thesis, on estimation. And he started noticing that it seems like in order to estimate things, students were struggling because they didn't know the units of the quantities that they were trying to use. So he gave a very carefully structured, randomized test to the senior class in mechanical engineering. And just any version of a right answer would be fine, just the units. So this is what the results look like. Look only at the pattern for the moment. Green means right, yellow means don't know, and red was wrong. Just look at the top. Only one of our seniors didn't know the units of time. Weight was a little tough because it's got gravity in it, so kind of 25% missed that. Down in the middle was Reynolds number. Reynolds number is a very important idea, that a number, but it has no units. So half of our seniors knew that. Entropy is pretty important, especially given the focus on world energy issues. Frighteningly small number of students knew the units of energy. So the overall pattern was that our graduating seniors knew the units, the 0th order manifestation of understanding, for half the things we had, quote, taught them. So I've just shown 2 studies that say, is it the right stuff and is it really being learned? I believe the major problem is the sage on the stage, because the sage is focusing on something that the sage likes, and the lecture format doesn't really work. We say it's the most efficient model. We have to do it that way. I think the only way we can justify that is that we pretend that the students remember what we say or learn what we say. And in our effort to cover it all, which we believe deeply we must cover it all, we actually bury it because it's really hard to uncover this stuff. And one of the things we do is kind of accept that the way we write on the blackboard slides is the way people think. That's not true for me. I think in 3 dimensions and color and sound. I run the movie in my head. And that's the way I develop understanding. So what should we do? I think we should get out of training, stop lecturing, stop writing textbooks, and stop building lecture halls. I think we should accept that a derivation very seldom conveys insight. In fact, I believe absolutely that equations explain only to those who already understand. If you understand something, the equation and the derivation is a beautiful little package. It's a Christmas gift. This is nice and neat. It really works. A equal A. But if you don't understand the phenomenon, it is not an explanation. So the improvements, first, I think we should understand the phenomenon before we present the abstraction. Going back to Ben, who left with his PhD and started teaching at Olin College, he asked the freshman class to understand click beetles, go download a program called Working Model, use it to design a thing that mimicked click beetles. So they looked at click beetles. And then they built things that were spring-loaded plastic widgets. It was a great group of kids, and they had a wonderful class. Mel here, learned how to use Working Model and used it to evaluate the length of the tail on her hopper. Look at what David did. As a freshman, with software that he taught himself how to use, produced a simulation that did the same thing as the real thing. When I was a student, that was impossible. That would have been a whole PhD in Fortran programming. But now we have access to tools that allow a great deal of insight. So I believe these students, having been through this exercise, are in a much better position to understand the abstractions that they will encounter in solid mechanics. I think we should use scaffolding, build the abstractions on experiments and experiences. Second, I think that learning with almost always trumps learning from. Now, why should you listen to such a grandiose statement? Well, I've been doing it a long time, so let me give you some examples. The senior design class in mechanical engineering at MIT is called Product Engineering Processes. And right now it's being taught by Dave Wallace. Dave is doing a fantastic job, much better than I ever did. But it's a very interesting course because in it we give the students a job too big, a time too short, a team too large, and a budget too small. Because they go from concepts to products in 14 weeks with a huge team and a very small budget. And they spend a lot of time in the lab together. They spend a lot of time working on things with one another. They spend a lot of time with the technicians that help. They spend a lot of time with the faculty, saying with. Because at the end, in about 15 years, no team has ever failed. And there's an average of 6 or 8 teams per semester. So they build amazing things that look and work essentially like a real product. All over the place in kind of product areas. That has given me a lot of insight about working with, because we faculty who are working with the students do not know the answer. They are not looking for something we already know. We're working together. I've also spent a lot of time on a course that used to be called 270, Introduction to Design. My hair was a good deal more abundant and quite a different color then. But that course was one in which we gave the students a kit of materials and asked them to design something to accomplish a specific task. And they accepted that easily. More importantly, they accepted the challenge of competing like crazy, but helping one another in the process. And they did that so well, I started calling it gracious professionalism. I think it's a very important piece of engineering. Now that course is alive and well. It's been taught by quite a few people since, but it became well known because of coverage of Discover the World of Science, and then when I started hosting Scientific American Frontiers, we also focused on it. And while I was doing that, I met Dean Kamen. And Dean Kamen is one of the most intelligent and hard-driving people on the planet today. He's the inventor of the Segway and peritoneal dialysis and water purification systems, et cetera, et cetera. So Dean had founded FIRST, and he and I together founded the first robotics competition. So we decided that we would do 270 on steroids. And the first year was relatively modest. It was called Maze Craze. It was in a tray of corn, and the robots were tethered, and they were kind of this big. But very quickly, we grew to the point where the championship was at Epcot, and Disney put on an amazing show. They built an arena for the first competition, but we outgrew that because they couldn't expand enough to accommodate. For the last several years, the championship has been in the Georgia Dome, and this are clips from the rap video to give you some idea of what it's like. 25,000 or so people show up, coming from all over the world. There's a lot of enthusiasm, an incredible amount of intensity, but the main thing we're trying to do is have a big celebration of what has happened up to that point. We try to make sure that some famous people are there to make sure that they know that society regards what they've done as important. And it's a big, important event. Now, FIRST has gracious professionalism, that same idea in its ethos. In fact, if you go Google the term gracious professionalism, you'll get many, many hits. And if you scan down them, almost all of them are connected to FIRST. In fact, the Urban Dictionary definition of gracious professionalism includes a wonderful statement that says a good example is giving an opponent a spare part so they don't have to forfeit in a match. That happened in the finale match a couple of years back. It's dear to my heart. So notice that well, these kids are shedding tears of joy not because they've won the robot competition, but they've won the Chairman's Award, which is about having the most exemplary relationship with community. These kids are from one of the toughest high schools in Phoenix, gang-dominated incredibly tough neighborhood, transition from gangs to going to college. Wonderful, wonderful stories. If you go through a first season without a tear in your eye, you need psychiatric help immediately. In all three levels of first, there is an Uber prize, the biggest prize, which has to do with something related to gracious professionalism. And first is making a difference. Not enough yet, but this is my estimate for this year. They're very slightly inflated over last year because these are tough economic times. But I think we will achieve those numbers quite handily. But first is about young people working with mentors. Magic things happen when kids and adults focus together. You heard me talking about robots and gracious together. I think that can happen with the right kind of interaction with mentors. I'm very proud that last year's freshman class at MIT was 10% first alumni. That's a big deal. So I argue, based on 40 years of experience, that we should use presence, being in the same room with somebody, our most valuable thing for education, and let's outsource the training to something else. So what's my plan? Well, I mentioned at the beginning making space for changes. I'm sure if you've been in a curriculum workshop, you find that no one wants to give up their block of time. We've got to cover this. So I want to try to create some space. Now, I'm not talking about distance learning per se or online education per se. Things I'm talking about could help these things, but that's not where I'm focused. If you download, if you Google my name in quotes and New Media's Impact, you can get a PDF of a chapter that I wrote in about 2004 for our book for the future of higher education, Forum on the Future of Higher Education. And there's some of my scenarios in there about what I'm talking about. But if you look at a more recent book, Clay Christensen of Innovator's Dilemma applies his Innovator's Dilemma argument, as in Bethlehem steel was replaced by mini mills because they were not innovating. Cable diggers got replaced by hydraulics. Floppy disks got replaced by other kind of memories, all because of the natural thing that happens. He argues with lots of data, the book is full of studies, that will happen to classical classroom education. He thinks it will happen gradually. So Clay and I struggle over that. I'm not patient. I don't want to be patient. I think we can do it much more quickly. And we already know, currently, there are lots of studies coming out that hybrids are probably the way to go. Some things that are on the screen and some things that involve people working together. E-readers are all over. Google will have their hardware-independent reader out soon. Netbooks are around. The much anticipated Apple tablet is a few months away. Smartphones are amazing things. Cloud computing, I depend on it. I'm sure most of you do too. Voice control is around. The next generation of wireless stuff is coming very fast. So we're going to have portable, color, wireless everywhere, inexpensive, fast, unlimited access to information. A profoundly valuable tool if we use it right. Given that capability that I just described, I think it's really silly to scan books and say, this is what we're giving you. I think it's time to create a new thing. The other methods that I talk about are things that are highly produced. They're sustainable. People that can pay, pay. You can give it away later. Have built-in feedback, and are done by super teams. These super teams are not a college professor and a graduate student sitting in a corner. They're producers and directors and writers and industrial designers and illustrators and animators and all the people that are involved in producing something of high quality. To make the contrast, this is a textbook that's a good design textbook. I picked it because it has 2 authors and 2 publishing companies. Here's a comparison. I took the credits at the end of the movie Chicago and compressed them into 16 seconds so that I could do it in a finite amount of time. There's over 700 names in this list. There's 50 to 75 companies, all of which, or most of which, are the best in the world. Why is it that when we do a textbook, its budget is invisible, but a movie is $100 million? When if people learn what's in the textbook, it's really a big deal. The movie doesn't matter. It's a speck in time and space. I believe that textbooks are roughly where 45 RPM vinyls were about 50 years ago. For me, for example, if I had the choice of the Yale library or I had access to Google, nanosecond decision. The versatile piece is the web. Things can happen. In physics, for example, John Belcher, a colleague, does a great job. He publishes papers on electromechanical fields. Probably 1/1000th of a percent of the population of the planet could read one of those papers and have some idea what an electromechanical field looks like. But when John worked with animators, which he does very well, he makes how fields work accessible to sixth graders. This is wonderful information on which you can build the abstraction. If you look at biology, biology is now wonderful three-dimensional stuff. I took a couple of clips out of a movie that you should download and watch. It's about 8 minutes long. I've got a couple of minutes here.
A glycoprotein on leukocyte microvilli.
This is done by the
both cell types.
biology faculty at Harvard, sponsored by the Hughes Medical Foundation. This was an expensive thing to do.
The outer leaflet of the lipid bilayer is enriched in sphingolipids and phosphatidylcholine. While the plus ends of some microtubules extend toward the plasma membrane, proteins stabilize the curved conformation of protofilaments from other microtubules, causing their rapid plus end depolymerization. Microtubules provide tracks along which membrane-bound vesicles
These are
travel
in
to
all
and
of our
from the
cells.
plasma membrane.
This is happening right now in millions of cases in
The
my body.
directional movement of these cargo vesicles
It's amazing
is due to
stuff.
a
I love
family
it.
of motor proteins linking vesicles and
So
microtubules.
why do we spend millions of dollars doing the research to understand stuff and not spend enough money to make sure that it's accessible? We should use animation. We should make things interactive. We should use continuous feedback so they can get better. We should have automatic quiz grading and automatic homework grading. We should allow school-to-school comparisons. The infrastructure should be really complete. If we had this super platform, imagine that we had 200,000 users, which is not a really big number. You could do more education research in a week than typically happens in a decade. But most importantly, for the first time in human history, we could have compound growth on the quality of the material that is now mostly in text. And look at the cost benefit. Let's look at the United States, a small part of the world market. But 77% of the freshmen coming into college need remedial math. 77%. That's a big number. The most recent data that I could get, 1992, 600,000 students took calculus as freshmen. You believe that? 42% failed. Now, if you do any reasonable set of economics, that's $2,000 per student per semester. Here at Vanderbilt, it's at least 2.5 times that. If you take that and multiply that by 200,000, that's $500 million a year that is lost. Now, I'm not arguing that you can make all of that go away, but I am very confident you can make half of it go away. So the opportunity cost is huge. If you were charging $100 for access for a semester and you had 200,000 students, you'd create enough cash flow to run a fairly substantial business. There's lots of other codified stuff that could be helped a lot as well. So the business opportunity, I think, is really large. I don't know who's going to do it. I think it is shovel-ready. I think we could start now. And I think it's a big deal. It requires a lot of planning at first because the content part of this block diagram is a big deal. A lot of stuff to be done The software backbone must be incredibly well structured so that it can allow those apps to be plugged in, those free apps and or those for pay apps, and for the social networks to be plugged in for communication. Whatever it is must continuously evolve to keep up with what's happening. The user interface must be beautiful and really, really work. And the group that are doing the maintenance and improvements must be world class. If I were a mechanical engineer and I were trying to learn differential equations, I'd want it in my flavor. So I'd want that part of the matrix to be filled out. I wouldn't want the symbolic manipulation version because I'm not a mathematician. I'm very visually oriented. So I'd want the second column. That's the one that I'd want to do. And I wouldn't be interested in a lecture, but maybe if I got bogged down, I could go over into the lecture version and listen to the world's best lecture on that topic. Certainly wouldn't want a textbook. So we could find out what happened. How much do you retain? A few minutes, a few hours, a few weeks, months, the rest of your life, what you'd really like to do? I frightened my colleagues at MIT by saying, let's stop giving final exams, because that really doesn't, that doesn't find out what you really want to do. Let's wait till sometime in the following semester, and your student gets an email and says, okay, now here's your final. That notion just scares my colleagues to death, because deep down we know that would get at something that we're not doing now. We could do that. If we had those users, best data ever on the efficacy of various styles, best data ever on how to scaffold, best data ever on what had been retained. And maybe it has to start with a not-for-profit arm's-length organization, and maybe you have to get endorsements from people like the National Academy of Engineering, which I've gotten a strong positive feedback from. I've even gotten a strong indication that the State Department would be interested, because as a diplomatic tool, what a powerful thing. The professional organizations, maybe the presidents of 3 very famous universities, maybe 3 other universities that have a particular interest in this stuff get on board. And then the creme de la creme of whatever companies see a comparative advantage for them in being part of this exercise. I was, last week, an article in the Washington Post pointed out that the textbook market in the United States is $7 billion. It's a big number. Just California claims that they could save $400 million on math and science books. The article included some nice musings from a delighted teacher because she was not having to grade homework. And there's a lot of discussion about whether this should be open source or not, and whether it should be commercial or free. I think the real issue, the real thing we should be discussing, is how to make sure that it is super high quality, sustainable, and done in a very systematic way. I believe the world's text could be an unbelievably powerful cultural influence. Then we could spend time on education. We could use our presence the way we should. So let me muse about my dream education. Especially after the introduction, I'll overcharacterize. Liberal education is too much about a small number of people and nothing about nature. I think we ought to move the center about a larger group of people, and certainly about nature. If you have not seen this, you really should watch it. This is the first 2 minutes of a wonderfully powerful video that you can find on YouTube.
Astronomers in 1996 attempted to do something extraordinary. They pointed the Hubble Space Telescope into a part of the sky that seemed utterly empty, a patch devoid of any planets, stars, and galaxies. This area was close to the Big Dipper, a very familiar constellation, and the patch of sky was no bigger than a grain of sand held out at arm's length. This was a somewhat risky move by the scientists. After all, observing time on this telescope is in very high demand, and some questioned whether it would be wasted trying to look at nothing. There was a real risk that the images returned would be as black as the space at which it was being pointed. Nevertheless, they opened the telescope, and slowly, over the course of 10 full days, photons that had been traveling for over 13 billion years finally ended their journey on the detector of humanity's most powerful telescope, their feeble signals collected almost one by one. When the telescope was finally closed and the images were processed, the light from over 3,000 galaxies had covered the detector, producing one of the most profound and humbling images in all of human history. Every single spot, smear, and dot was an entire galaxy, and each one containing hundreds of billions of stars.
So I think that is a wonderful example of why human chauvinism is just silly. I mean, I can't imagine that the universe is aware of us at all. So I think a liberal education should include quite a lot about nature. This overused word, I heard it 4 times on the trip down, is a wonderful word. And seeking awe is one of the things that we all should do. And nature is full of it. So about politics, I believe that it's very clear, particularly now, that if you say to people that you are a libertarian or a Democrat or a Republican or a conservative or a liberal, that you better know why. If you are what you are because of where you're born, that's stupid. It's intellectually irresponsible. So I think educated people must have some really good answers to things like this. Economics, we did a macro meltdown. I'm on the audit committee of a billion-dollar corporation, and I never heard of credit default swaps. Unfortunately, I know what they are now. Microeconomics, we have to learn what discount rates are all about. We have to learn that we can't spend money that we have not yet earned. We're in the middle of one of the largest experiments ever in government and economics, and I don't know how it's going to turn out. So I think we have to make friends with the knot in our stomach because it's not going to be easy. In the hierarchy of needs, I think that probably most people in this room are not bogged down in the bottom part. We're lucky we have some people that love us and we have some self-esteem. And we all are here because we want to muck around in the top of it. But society in general kind of got punch drunk and tried to go buy stuff. And that was supposed to be a shortcut to happiness. I don't think that works. I think the academy needs to help people understand how to be happier. Religion is the source of a lot of tension in the world right now. And I believe that if you lump the world religions into 6 roughly the same size groups, they have conflicting views on what truth is. I think you better be able to sort out what version of truth you believe in. If you look at ethics, I wrote the foreword to a textbook on engineering ethics by Dr. Carolyn Whitbeck, and the first line of the foreword was this. And I really do believe that unless the profession of engineering directly addresses ethical awareness, it's not likely that I will be able to do that. So far, okay. But I don't think, to me, the ethics that is robust is not it's not the professional society's list. It's stuff that comes from inside, based on empathy and reason. Very interesting look at that from Simon Baron-Cohen's book, The Essential Difference. He points out that in a space of empathizing and systemizing, now obviously we're all where the star is, right? We're really good at both. But based on lots of testing, men test 70-30 toward systemizing, and women test 70-30 toward empathizing. That's one of the reasons that I want more women in the technical professions. A good, solid reason, I think. I think epistemology is going to be very important to the young people in this room. If you don't think you know how you know some of the stuff you think you know, it's not good. I think the level of introspection that you will have in your career is probably a good deal deeper. My wife Margaret and I have, for about 15 years, had a 4 a.m. book club. We get up, I turn the alarm off, turn the coffee pot on, and we started reading together. And we have tried to sort out the difference between what we believe and what we think we believe. It's really hard. It's a wonderful thing to pursue, and oddly enough, it's a wonderfully romantic thing to do because we've learned a lot about each other and ourselves in the process. This is my why Woody doesn't have a tattoo slide. I'm the guy with the pistol. I was 15 or 16 in the backwoods of Louisiana. I think if I had gotten a piece of permanent body art at that time, there's almost no chance that I would like it now. So that's a comment on lifelong learning. Lifelong learning is an absolutely wonderful thing to pursue, and lifelong change is a wonderful thing to pursue. So my closing comments is that students demand education over training. Faculty, stop training wherever you possibly can. And all of us, let's get better at both. Because we need to learn to enjoy making our brain hurt. You guys are going to have to think really hard in your life. I think it's informed, creative thinking, all three, all the time. And if you do that, you have some chance of getting invited into the game so that you can attain some satisfaction and thus have a shot at a meaningful life. Thank you. We started a little bit late. We have some time for questions. Am I moderating myself? Or?
Yes.
Ooh, scary, sir.
I'm trying to understand the first part of your talk. There seems to be some advocacy of an anecdotal project-based approach to engineering education. What happens when you have to calculate angular momentum or do an integral? You can't look it up on Google if you don't know that those things exist.
I obviously did not make myself clear. I think calculating angular momentum comes from training. Thinking about when to do it is education. I believe the training piece of that can be exported to a screen that somebody can learn wherever they are, but in this activity where you work with students, you would then work with them and they would do that and it would have meaning. But you wouldn't spend time telling them that in a lecture format in my world.
And how are they going to know how to do it?
They're going to learn it themselves. I think it'd be very important to treat students like adults and say, look, thermodynamics is really important. Go learn the codified part of it by yourself. And I believe we have to do that. I understand that you don't agree, but we can discuss it more. I'd love to have the long discussion about that. Other questions? Sir?
You made reference to something called World's Text. I was wondering if that was a sort of non-westernized great books program.
I made that word up. I apologize. I just realized that that does overlap with some other. It has some baggage, so I need to change that term. Having something that could be regarded as a great platform for teaching yourself stuff, I think would be a powerful cultural influence. So if there was a place that you could go, and in the developed world, we could probably pay for access so that we keep it going. We could decide to give it away to the mythical person in Nigeria who wants to learn.
You talked about wonderful technology tools, and my question is, how can we make sure there's equitable sharing of those tools? Because some people can buy them and some people can't afford to have them, and so there's going to be sort of a divide.
Sure, and I think the divide between the haves and have-nots is rapidly coming down. As many of you know, places like Singapore beat the United States in spades getting to being fully connected. I think we must do that. But providing a thing, there's a good argument. This thing has a super amount of connectivity and is a great opportunity. But budget dust, literally budget dust in the federal numbers right now could pay for those devices. So rather than have the government develop this thing that I'm talking about, I think the government might provide the devices. And the device, right now, the average number for a college student year of textbooks is $1,000. That'll buy you a netbook and a year's connectivity. So it's cheaper to do the hardware than the books. And it's going to get even less expensive. Others?
Where did the College Board and Graduate Record exam fit in your...
Well, I think one of the things that we ought to do is start getting rid of these sharp boundaries between high school and college. Let's imagine that Vanderbilt found some people that were doing really well on this stuff that they were interacting with. You got a lot of data, huge amount of information. You could admit students conditionally when they're 14 years old or something, and if they're still doing good. And the other end of the spectrum, I can't imagine that any profession is going to be viable if you end your, quote, education at the end of your college career. I think we smear it through the rest of your life and reach further back down. And maybe this, maybe the time that you spend in a college or a university is a different kind of experience. I believe that international experience is so important. So I would love it if, while you were learning some of this codified stuff, if I were an engineering student, I would be learning differential equation stuff on the screen. While I was in an inner city in the United States or someplace where my help was needed and I was trying to provide water. Right now, the freshman year is optimizing the number of times you can get drunk each week and still make good grades. That's probably not the best way to do it. I think there's a good opportunity to spend some time learning about yourself before you are a student.
It's not on my campus.
Oh, so our chancellor was looking around to see who was laughing. I saw that. He's taking names. Question.
Do we have to have some sort of hierarchy in education and training?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you facilitate this hierarchy in a sort of dynamic environment?
Help me understand what you mean by hierarchy.
You have to do you have to walk before you can drive?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have to solve, integral differential equations before you can do X?
Okay, I think you have to understand why you would solve an integral differential equation before.
That's accepted, but we have to have...
But it's not done. We still, we teach all that stuff that it's just rattling around, not connected to anything. And I believe that, well, let me state it another way. I grew up in a very small town in Louisiana. My father was a welder. I built the first car that I owned. I think I learned more engineering from my father than I did from all of my many years as a student. I learned to do some very powerful things, but I had a real advantage, I think, because I understood why I might study strength of materials and why I'd worry about whether the welding was going to, cause the metallurgy to change around the bead and stuff. The stuff that I was exposed to had some context. So, and if I need it, by the way, the data that we have from surveys show that engineers almost never do what you just asked them. They simply don't do it. And when you talk about engineering 2020, do you think engineers in 2020 will solve a differential equation? Will they need to know how? I don't think that the classical analog math is likely to be relevant. Finite different math, statistics, some other stuff. But I spent a lot of time learning things like Castigliano's method. I would be laughed out of the room if I went to my boss and said, here's the closed form analytical solution for this thing. She would say, I don't want that. I want an estimate that gets a bound on it, and I want a finite element model that allows us to do a much more complex thing. So I think things have changed a lot with regard to how we use analog math. Other questions?
If students are responsible for learning the fundamentals by themselves, what would encourage students to learn things they don't want to learn in order to have a well-rounded education?
I think I'm not proposing that you're only responsible for the things you want to learn. I'm not proposing an exploration version. I'm saying that we were working together on an engineering project and you were designing a press to make a water filter for the developing world, and you needed to know what the shape of that press platen would be, I would expect you to go learn what you need to know in order to make that reasonable. A lot of data, by the way. That particular example, one of our students had taken a high-level mechanics course at MIT, and this thing that he was trying to analyze was completely unrelated to what it should look like, and he used fracture toughness analysis, which is absolutely irrelevant. So if we work together and I helped you say, you know, this is kind of hard stuff, but go learn it and come back and we'll do it, that's the model that I would advocate. I went to a school, by the way, not long ago and gave a lecture and discovered that the faculty took attendance. I can't imagine that makes sense. That's not treating students as adults.
So if I understand what you're proposing is that college becomes a series of projects and independent studies?
Well,
Right, and also, sorry, I'll give two questions at once, but then I want to know what your opinion is on grading and grading.
right. I have the advantage of having spent a lot of time with design courses, and with one exception that I think was kind of a pathological case, when students have come to me and said, I'd like to contest my grade, when I show them all the information that I have and where they ranked compared to other people based on peer reviews and performance on things, it's always been enough. I believe in our design courses at MIT, we have more data about the students than any lecture course I've ever known, because we've worked with them. We really know a lot about what they've done. That's a wonderful luxury.
So the college experience in general becomes a combination of independent studies with multimedia tools and projects.
Right, and because the system is the way it is, I spent a lot of time, you know, when 270 was being very well known, I had times when I had 225 students in that class, and I met with them twice a week. But they all, you know, over 90% came every time because they knew we were going to do something. I was not going to tell them something that they could read somewhere else. We were going to do something that was not accessible any other way. And it's really hard. It spends a lot more time. If you look at what Dave Wallace is doing now in 299, it's absolutely wonderful experience for the students because they do stuff every time they come to lab, to lecture, quote, something's going to happen. There's an exchange. They work with each other. They're broken into teams. I've got some delightful data on some of the things that have happened there. So it's hard, but I think it's much better.
Last question. I'm sympathetic to what you've said.
But
But I have a nagging persecution, and that is that you seem to advocate learning in groups, and yet every meaningful experience in my entire life, going back to my childhood, has been gained not from interacting with peers, but from interacting with more senior people that were wiser and more knowledgeable in the things that I was interested in. How do I reconcile the new way with what is my only experience?
I failed so badly to communicate. I'm very sorry that you got that impression. The thing you're describing as the pinnacle is the pinnacle. Working with mentor, working with a mentor, apprenticeship kind of interaction is what education is about. The training stuff you can do with a screen by yourself. But I absolutely agree. The most valuable thing that you can do is share an experience with an expert. And I think that's what college professors ought to be doing. Thank you very much.